So we're continuing with part 1, chapter 2 of Individuation in the Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're starting from page 79 of the translation. So we saw the last section, we just started subsection 2, but the previous section we saw the analysis of different crystals that have or certain substances that have crystalline forms that have different levels of stability. So sulfur that can crystallize in one form, and then that form can recrystallize into a second form. And then now in this section, we're looking at the actual formation of the crystal out of an amorphous substance. So we're now looking at the absolute genesis of a physical individual rather than the relative genesis. So that's about where we are. And he also mentioned right at the beginning of the section that this different looking at the absolute genesis as opposed to the relative one will require a certain modification of the ideas of individuation. So we can keep that in mind as we read this section about what the differences are between the relative individuation that we saw in the last section and the absolute individuation that we're seeing in this section. Okay, so I'll start from the top of 79. We have another one of these long paragraphs, so I'll read about a page and then we'll stop to discuss. For example, let's consider the property that is characteristic of the crystalline state, anisotropy. The crystal possesses two types of completely different anisotropy. The first is continuous anisotropy. Certain vectoral properties of crystals vary continuously with direction. This is the case of electrical, magnetic, and elastic properties, and properties related to thermodilation, caloric conductibility, and the speed of the propagation of light. But alongside these properties, we note other properties that vary discontinuously with direction. They are expressed by the existence of linear directions or planar directions with particular properties, whereas the neighboring directions do not possess them to any degree. Thus, the crystal can only be limited externally by certain linear and planar directions, according to the law stated by René de Lille in 1783. The dihedral angles that make up the natural facets of a crystal are constant for the same type. Similarly, the cohesion, such as it is revealed by the planes of cleavages or the appearances of parting, manifests a discontinuous anisotropy. Ultimately, the most beautiful example of discontinuous anisotropy is the diffraction of X-rays. The bundle of X-rays that strikes a crystal is reflected in a limited number of planes with well-determined orientations. However, these properties of discontinuous anisotropy arise from the genesis of the crystal as an individual and not as an exemplary of a type. Each individual is structured in this way. In an aggregate of crystals assembled without any order, each crystal has defined its facets, its dihedral angles, and its corners according to a direction of the ensemble that is explained by external circumstances, whether mechanical or chemical, and yet according to rigorously determined internal rapport starting from the singular genesis. For the crystal, the fact of being an individual consists in the fact that it has developed in this way relative to itself. There is ultimately at the end of the genesis a crystal individual, because an organized ensemble has developed around the crystalline germ that incorporates an initially amorphous matter that is rich in potentials by structuring it according to a proper arrangement of all the parts with respect to one another. Here there is a veritable interiority of the crystal that consists in the fact that the order of the elementary particles is universal within a determined crystal. The unicity of this structure for all the elements of the same individual designates the initial existence of a germ that has not only initiated the crystallization as a change of state, but also has the unique principle of the structuration of the crystal in its particularity. This structural germ has been the origin of an active orientation that is progressively imposed onto all the elements included in the crystal as its growth continues. An internal historicity, which extends throughout the genesis, starting from the microphysical germ all the way up to the ultimate limits of the macrophysical edifice, creates a completely particular homogeneity. The germ's initial structure cannot positively involve the crystallization of an amorphous body if the latter is not in a metastable equilibrium. A certain energy is required in the amorphous substance that receives the crystalline germ. But from the moment the germ is present, it possesses the value of a principle. Its structure and its orientation take control of this energy of the metastable state. The crystalline germ, containing nothing more than an extremely small amount of energy, is nevertheless capable of guiding the structuration of a mass of matter several million times greater than its own. So here he's discussing the relationship between a crystal's structure and the substance of which the crystal is made. So this is, I posted a link a little bit earlier in the chat, if you scroll up, that looks at different crystal families or crystal structures. And there's a limited number of different possible crystal structures. There's 32, and they're divided into 6 or 7 groups, depending on how you group the different structures. And any chemical substance that will crystallize has to crystallize in one of those forms, and into one of those 32 forms. And so you can classify crystals based on the different symmetries of those forms, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we continue. But here he's pointing to the fact that the individuation of this crystal out of the amorphous mass in which it forms has to do with the way that the structure of that crystal is determined by the chemical nature of the substance. And we'll see a little bit more on that as we continue as well. Right. Yeah, so Alyosha posted in the chat here, what is the relationship between these 32 forms and the discussion of types that we saw, I think, last week or the week before. It's the existence. So in that discussion earlier of types, what Simondon argues is that it's the existence of discontinuity in certain properties of a physical individual that makes it possible to classify those individuals under types or under species. And so in this case, the 32 different types are discontinuous. There's no intermediate forms between one type and the next. So in that same way, we could use these properties as principles of classification of crystals, so that we can assign a type under one of these 32 forms to crystals, because those 32 forms are discontinuous with respect to each other. Yeah, and as 61 posted it in the chat there, so this has to do with space groups in the mathematical study of the system of all the possible transformations, so rotations and reflections and so on, of a shape. Basically determines the different possible crystalline structures that can exist. So it's the different possible symmetries are the different possible crystalline structures in a sort of simplified way. But yeah, so there's a deep mathematical reason why there are certain crystalline structures that are possible. So yeah, I don't know, it's kind of cool. But the last little bit that I wanted to point to in this passage that we just read is this notion of an active orientation. So in the last line on 79 and going into 80, it says, this structural germ has been the origin of an active orientation that is progressively imposed onto all the elements included in the crystal as its growth continues. So we'll see more about this orientation or polarization is the term that he uses later on. But the structural germ imposes onto this amorphous mass some sort of directionality, so that certain directions have properties that other directions don't have, whereas the amorphous mass is basically the same in all directions. And so this orientation or polarization is what's characteristic of the structural germ, or the action of the structural germ onto the amorphous mass. Okay, so I think we can continue from here. If someone else would like to read, we're at undoubtedly this modulation.
Undoubtedly, this modulation is possible because the crystal's successive stages during its development serve as relays for this initial structuring singularity, but it nevertheless remains true that the passage from the initial germ to the crystal resulting from the structuration of a single layer of molecules around this germ has indicated the capacity of amplification of the ensemble constituted by the germ and the amorphous milieu. The phenomenon of growth is consequently automatic and indefinite, since all the successive layers of the crystal have the capacity to structure the amorphous milieu that surrounds them, while this milieu remains metastable. In this sense, a crystal is endowed with an indefinite power of growth. A crystal can have its growth stopped, but it can never be considered complete, and it can always continue to grow if it is put back into a metastable milieu that it can structure. It is important to note quite particularly that the nature of the exteriority or interiority of the conditions is modified by the genesis itself. At the moment when the crystal is not yet constituted, the energetic conditions can be considered as exterior to the crystalline germ, whereas the structural conditions are carried by this germ itself. Conversely, when the crystal has grown, it has at least partially incorporated certain amounts of substance that constituted the support of the potential energy of the metastable state while they were amorphous. Thus, we cannot speak of the energy external to the crystal, for this energy is carried by a substance that is incorporated within the crystal in its own growth. The energy is only provisionally exterior. Furthermore, the interiority of the crystalline's germ structure is not absolute and does not autonomously regulate the structuration of the amorphous mass. In order for this modulating action to be able to be carried out, the structural germ must bring with it the structure corresponding to the crystalline system in which the amorphous substance can crystallize. The crystalline germ does not have to have the same chemical nature as the amorphous crystalline substance, but there must be an identity between the two crystalline systems in order for the apprehension of the potential energy contained in the amorphous substance to be carried out. The difference between the germ and the amorphous crystallizable milieu is therefore not constituted by the absolute presence or absence of a structure, but by the state of actuality or virtuality of this structure. The individuation of a system essentially results from the meeting of a mainly structural condition and a mainly energetic condition, but this meeting is not necessarily fruitful. In order for it to have constitutive value, it is also necessary that the energy can be actualized by the structure in accordance with the local material conditions. This possibility neither depends on the structural condition alone nor on the energetic condition alone, but on the compatibility of the germ's crystalline systems and the substance that constitutes the milieu of this germ. Thus, a third condition is manifested that we have not been able to note in the preceding case, because it was necessarily fulfilled. Since the
let's stop there. Actually, just to have some time for discussion of that. This is an important passage. Thanks. So we had some discussion the last couple weeks about these conditions that he points to, where he sometimes talks about three conditions of individuation. Sometimes he talks about two conditions. So we have the structural, the energetic, and the material, and then he sometimes groups the material and energetic conditions together as sort of one group of conditions, and the structural condition would be the other set of conditions. But here he sets it out more clearly as three different kinds of conditions of individuation. So we have let's see. So we have the energetic condition. So that's the general. That's at the level of the whole system. So in the case of the crystalline, or in the crystal formation, this would be the temperature of the system, for example, as one component of the energetic condition. And then we have the structural condition, which is the presence of the crystalline germ. But those two alone don't account for the capacity of crystallization of the system, because we need the third principle or third condition, which is the material condition. So the material in question, the substance that is in the amorphous state, has to have the potential to crystallize in the same structure as the crystalline germ. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same substance, but it has to have the same crystalline structure in order for that crystallization to be possible. So that material condition is the third one. And so here we have one of the differences between the relative individuation we saw in the last subsection and the absolute individuation, because as he points out, in the case of the relative individuation, that relationship between the structural condition and the energetic condition was necessarily given, because we're dealing with the same substance in different crystalline structures. Whereas now, when we're talking about an absolute individuation or absolute genesis, that condition is not necessarily fulfilled. So we need to identify the material condition as a separate condition. So that's sort of why we saw the alternation between the either describing it as two conditions or describing it as three conditions. So yeah, that's what sort of explains that sort of alternation that we saw. Yeah, and Alyosha posted the footnote in the chat there, and so here he points to, or he compares the crystallization process to modulation, which we saw. His discussion of modulation we saw in the first chapter, but here we have in this operation of modulation, we have three different energies, or so there's the potential energy of the amorphous substance, and then the crystalline germ modulates that potential energy. So there's a slight energy coming from the crystalline germ, and then there's the coupling of the germ with the amorphous substance, which is the third third energy in the system. Yeah, there's actually in the translation of the footnote, there's I think I would not translate it that way when he says which is confused with the fact that the amorphous substance and the germ form a physical system. I would just say which is identified, I think would be better. Which is identified with the fact that the amorphous substance and the germ form a physical system.
So I'm curious about those three conditions now that you're talking about, and if it connects with this discussion of interiority that came just a little bit earlier. I think it was the last reading. So there is a paragraph where he describes the veritable interiority of the crystal, or I guess a sentence. And that kind of sounded like what you were describing as the material condition. And he calls it a universal, a kind of universal order of the elementary particles. And then he says the unicity of this structure is given by the germ. I think that's what, the initial existence of a germ. And then he calls this the particularity of the, I guess, of the individual. And I'm wondering if, like, are we looking at the two conditions here spelled out, like the structural and the material? Or is the material something else that's not really showing up in this sentence here? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. So yeah, that was back on page 79. So the interiority, when he talks about this veritable interiority of the crystal, so this has to do with the way that if we look at the system as a whole, so partly crystallized and partly still amorphous, then the interior of the crystal is structured by that initial structuring germ. So it's already undergone that process of structuration. So it's interior to the crystal, not just in a geometrical sense, but in the sense that it's undergone the structuration process, as opposed to the amorphous milieu in which the crystal is still situated. The rest of that amorphous milieu has not undergone that crystallization process or structuration process, so it's exterior to the crystal. But I'm wondering, I don't think that notion of the material condition has been really introduced at that point yet of the development. So he's pointing to the role of that structuring role of the germ, but then it's only as we go through a little bit later on page 80 that we get this introduction, and then on to 81 actually. Yeah, so it's on 81 that he introduces the material condition as the third condition that is needed in order to account for the coupling of the germ and the energetic state of the system. So yeah, I think it's only on 81 that he introduces that third condition. Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat here. So Triad had a question about this coupling between the energetic and structural conditions. So is there to be an assumed continuity to the other conditions, some similarity in quality or kind? So we'll see, I think in the next page or so, a bit more about how we should be understanding this coupling or the material condition that accounts for it. But he's going to explain it in terms of a rapport. So it's neither purely qualitative or quantitative. It has to do with an analogical rapport between the parts of the system, so the structural and the energetic aspects of the system. But yeah, we'll see more on that in the next page or so. So stay tuned. And then there's also the question from Angus. So is the analogical rapport between the amorphous milieu and the structure of the germ the same as the homogeneity of matter we discussed in the brick-making example? In that example, this homogeneity was necessary for the communication between the orders of magnitude. I'm not sure it's the same, but it's definitely related. So yeah, in the brick-making example, it was the homogeneity of the matter, the fact that the clay has been prepared, is what allows for the mold to impose a form onto the clay. So that preparation of the clay plays the role of setting up the communication between the two orders of magnitude of the mold, the form of the mold, and the microstructure of the clay that is going to go into the brick. And here we have similarly the material condition is playing the role of setting up the communication between the energetic condition, which is a condition of the whole system, so at a higher order of magnitude than the individual, and then the structural germ, which is at a lower order of magnitude than the individual that will result. So it's playing the same role. I'm not sure if we should fully identify them, but it's playing the same role in this process of individuation as the homogeneity of the matter. And then there was another comment from Alyosha asking about what the relationship is between the material condition. So is material condition the same thing as a relation and as a milieu? I think it's not. We can't exactly identify the material condition with the milieu, but the material condition is the relationship between the potential structure of the milieu, the structures that it is capable of taking on, and the structure of the crystalline germ. So the material condition is always a relational condition, and we'll see a little bit more on that as we continue. But the substance in its amorphous state has a certain latent structure. It's only capable of taking on certain structures, and those have to line up with the structure of the germ in order for the individuation to happen. So the material condition is the virtual properties of the relation. I don't even think that's quite it either. So I would say the material condition is the relation between the potentialities of the amorphous substance and the actual structure of the germ. So there's a relationship between the potential on the one side and the actual on the other side. Okay, so we can continue with the next bit. If someone else would like to read, we're at here it is no longer a question.
Here it is no longer a question of the scalar quantity of potential energy, nor of the pure vectoral properties of the structure carried by the germ, but a question of a third type of rapport, which can be called analogical, between the latent structures of the still amorphous substance and the germ's actual structure. This condition is required for there to be a veritable amplifying relation between this structure of the germ and this potential energy carried by an amorphous substance. This relation is neither purely quantitative nor purely qualitative. It is different than a rapport of qualities or a rapport of quantities. It defines the mutual interiority of a structure and of a potential energy within a singularity. This interiority is not spatial, for we are witnessing here the action of a structural germ on its environment. It is not an equivalence of terms, since the terms, statically and dynamically, are dissymmetrical. We use the word analogy to designate this relation because the content of Platonic thought relative to paradigmatism in its ontological foundations seems to us more fruitful in this sense for consecrating the introduction of a relation that includes energetic quantity and structural quality. This relation is information. The germ singularity is effective when it arrives in a tense hylomorphic situation. A precise analysis of the relation between a structural germ and the milieu that it structures shows that this relation requires the possibility of a polarization of the amorphous substance by the crystalline germ. The active range of this polarization can be very minuscule. From the moment that a first layer of amorphous substance has become a crystal around the germ, it plays the role of a germ for another layer. And the crystal can at that point develop bit by bit. The relation of a structural germ to the potential energy of a metastable state is established in this polarization of amorphous matter. We must therefore seek the foundation of a genesis constituting the individual here. From the very beginning, and from a macrophysical point of view, the individual always appears as the bearer of polarization. Indeed, it is worth noting that a polarization is a transitive property, or that polarization is a transitive property. It is simultaneously a consequence and a cause. A body constituted by a process of polarization exerts a series of polarizing functions, merely one of which is the crystal's capacity to grow. Perhaps it would be possible to generalize the physical consequences of Pierre Curie's 1894 studies on symmetry. Curie's laws can be stated in two forms. The first utilizes current concepts. A phenomenon possesses all the elements of symmetry of the causes that produce it, and the dissymmetry of a phenomenon is found again in the causes. Furthermore, the produced effects can be more symmetrical than the causes, which means that the reciprocal of the first law is not true. This amounts to stating that if a phenomenon presents a dissymmetry, this dissymmetry should be found again in the causes. This dissymmetry is what creates the phenomenon. I'll just read this next line because I think it's related. But above all, the particular interest of Curie's laws resides in their precise statement. A phenomenon can exist in a milieu that possesses its characteristic symmetry or that of one of the subgroups of this symmetry. It will not be manifested in a more symmetrical milieu.
So here we have, this is what I mentioned a little while ago about this notion of polarization. It's only insofar as the germ introduces something like a polarization or a privileged direction or some sort of difference into the amorphous mass that it can begin this individuation process. So there's some direction that has certain properties and some other direction that doesn't have those properties once that germ is introduced into the amorphous mass. And this polarization proceeds gradually throughout the substance, so that the germ, it polarizes the one layer of molecules around the limit of the germ, and then that layer plays the same polarizing role to the next layer, and so on. And so that's what it means for this polarization to be transitive, so that so he says it's simultaneously a consequence and a cause. So one transitive, one polarized entity polarizes the rest of the limit around itself within the amorphous substance, and then that next layer plays the same polarizing role for the succeeding layer. So the first layer that forms is the consequence of the polarization introduced by the structural germ, and then it also serves as the cause of the next layer of polarization. So it plays both roles successively. So that's what that calling it transitive means here.
So I'm curious about this kind of a middle, or I don't know what to call it exactly, but this material condition that we're looking at here. I guess it's a kind of middle, it seems, or has a certain maybe unifying structure or a kind of mediating structure or function. And I guess I'm wondering about one of the formulations is it's neither qualitative nor quantitative. And I guess I'm wondering how those two are distributed. So it seems maybe that the quantitative is proper to the potential energy. I think he had called it a scalar quantity at one point. I'm not sure where exactly. And then the quality perhaps is can be attributed to the germ as having like it's being, something we can describe in concrete terms. It has a shape, it has an appearance. So, and then somehow the material condition mediating between these two, or being sort of that medium where quantity turns into quality, or somehow they relate in some way. So anyway, just a kind of a shot at an interpretation.
Sorry, I was just trying to find that line that you referred to where he describes the potential energy as a scalar property, or a scalar quantity, and the structural germ as having a vectoral quantitative structure. basically what that means is just that the energy of a system is a number in a straightforward sense. So you can measure the energy. It's so many calories or whatever unit of measurement you use. Whereas the qualitative germ has not only a number associated with it, but also a direction. So in that sense, it's a vector. So that the structural germ is characterized by the fact that it has this directionality to it. So it's not the same in all directions. That certain directions have certain properties, and other directions don't have those properties. And then, so the relationship, or what relationship does that have to the this material condition? Yeah. So then on 81, is it? If I can find the passage. Oh yeah. So here's that passage on 81, where he distinguishes between the scalar quantity of potential energy and the pure vectorial properties of the structure carried by the germ. And I think it is right to identify that later on with this distinction between the quantitative and the qualitative. So it's the qualitative is has to do with the structural germ, and then the quantitative has to do with the energetic properties of the system. But sorry, I'm trying to find the next line. Right. So here again on 81, a little bit lower down, he says this relation. So the relation that is brought about by the material condition, this amplifying relation between the germ and potential energy. This relation is neither purely quantitative nor purely qualitative. It is different than a rapport of qualities or a rapport of quantities. It defines the mutual interiority of a structure and of a potential energy within a singularity. So so it's neither purely quantitative, it's neither purely having to do with the energetic system, nor purely qualitative, so having to do with the structural germ, but it's what accounts for the combination of the two, or how the two interact with each other. So it's the condition of the material condition is the condition of that relation between the qualitative and quantitative aspects, and so it does play something like a mediating role in that sense.
So for me, it almost reads like a form of intensity there, or some like an intense relationship that is within this germ that is to spread out when it hits the right threshold in a specific milieu, for example. So there is this. I'm searching for another term that other than intention or tension here. It's like suspense, or in some sort of suspended stress, if you understand what I mean. That through this germ, through this imbalance that is not yet purely chaotic in relation to this amorphous milieu on the outside, has some sort of protostructure to it, some sort of tension that then expands like a trigger you pull, or something like that.
Yeah, he does use the word tension. I think we saw that in the last couple pages, maybe page 80 or 81. But he uses it not of the germ, but of the hylomorphic situation. So the existence of the system having this divergence of the different orders of magnitude that are not communicating with each other yet, until that the germ is introduced. So it's that condition of the system that is tense, that has the tension. So it's the tension is inherent in the whole system as a whole, the system as a whole, rather than in the germ itself. the germ is what I think, as you said, triggers the individuation process. So the tension pre-exists the individuation process, and then the introduction of the structural germ is the trigger for that process.
I'm thinking of the case of vaccines as a possible example here. I wonder if this works. So if we take the propagation of a virus to be a certain kind of individuation, and I suppose the potential energy in this case might be something like the propensity of an organism to display symptoms, or to develop a disease, or to develop a the flu, let's say, or the illness. And then the vaccine, what it seems to do is to come into the middle, in a sense, between the organism and the germ, right? And to prevent that match, or that the kind of the alignment, or there's a certain opening in the organism that allows the virus to come in, right? And when a person is vaccinated, that opening is closed to a large degree. And so I guess vaccination would kind of demonstrate what this material condition might be in this case. And it sort of cancels that condition, right? So that the individuation of the virus is no longer possible.
Yeah, I think that's a topical example, of course, but it's also an interesting application of the concept, because viruses actually do have a crystalline form, or they can exist under a crystalline form when they're outside of an organism. So they can sort of survive in this dormant state, and then they can be introduced into an organism, and then bring about reproduction. But yeah, so in this case, the usefulness of that example is because, as you pointed out, there has to be that same sort of compatibility between the organism in which the virus is introduced and the structure of the virus. So only certain organisms can be the host for a certain virus, and so that so the virus acts as like a structural germ, in that it basically forces the host organism to produce copies of the virus, which then spread out throughout the organism. So this is in the same way that the crystal structures the amorphous substance, the virus is structuring the substance of the host organism into more viruses, basically. And then the role of the vaccine would be precisely to disrupt that compatibility, so that the host organism is no longer a suitable host for the virus. So yeah, I think that's a good example.
Have we talked about, sorry, I was AFK for some minutes, about his use of analogy yet?
No, we haven't really discussed that. That would be probably an important point to go over.
Mm-hmm. Because for me, when he uses analogy here, because he points this out very directly when he's using it in the paragraph you mentioned before, which can be called analogous between the latent structure and the still amorphous substance and the germ's actual structure, and then a little bit later, this interiority is not spatial, for we are witnesses here. The action of a structural germ in its environment. It is not an equivalence of terms, since the terms statically and dynamically are dissymmetrical. We use the word analogy to designate this relation, because the content of Platonic thought relative to paradigmatism is its ontological foundation seems to us more fruitful in this sense, for constrating the introduction of the relation that includes energetic quantity and structural quality. Because here he uses analogy in this very literal sense, right? Because analogy is this word combined of ana and logos, like it is the to make something in its logic or in its grammar, in its speech, analogous. It has the same structure, so to speak. It is in some sort similar, or it gets made similar in this sense. So it's quite a good description of this process, that like an expansion of this structural aspect of the germ into this amorphic milieu.
Yeah, that's the etymology there is useful. I wonder if anyone knows what Platonic dialogue he has in mind here when he talks about analogy, because I don't remember that specific reference to analogy in Plato. But we can also keep in mind that he when he talks about analogy, he always has in mind this transductive mode of thinking, which he describes, I think, in the introduction as being what is valid about analogical thinking. So transductive thinking is what is valid about analogical thinking. So here we see the more precise characterization of analogy, or what the ontological basis for analogy is precisely that material condition that makes compatible or that institutes the relationship between the energetic properties of the system and the structural germ. So it's always going to be something like this material condition that underlies any valid analogical thinking. Right, and then Alyosha has posted in the chat here a reminder about how the transductive approach, or a transductive method, always involves a relation to that which is thought, so that it's not just some sort of rapport in Simondon's sense, some sort of external relationship between an object known and a subject knowing it. But it's the relationship of knowledge is part of the structuring of the system as a whole. Okay, so I think we can go on. If someone else would like to read, we're on page 82, and we're starting at the characteristic symmetry.
The characteristic symmetry of a phenomenon is the maximum symmetry compatible with the existence of this phenomenon. This characteristic symmetry must be defined for each phenomenon, like the electrical field, the magnetic field, and the electromagnetic field, characteristic of the propagation of a light wave. However, it is acknowledged that the number of symmetry groups presenting one or several axes of isotropy is limited, and crystallographers have determined the possibility of only 7 groups. 1. The symmetry of the sphere. 2. The direct symmetry of the sphere, that of a sphere filled with a liquid endowed with a rotatory power. 3. The symmetry of the cylinder of revolution, which is that of an isotropic body compressed in one direction, that of the cylinder's axis. 4. The direct symmetry of the cylinder, i.e. that of a cylinder filled with a liquid endowed with a rotatory power. 5. The symmetry of the cone's frustum. 6. The symmetry of a cylinder turning on its axis. And 7. The symmetry of the rotating frustum of the cone. The first 2 systems present more of an axis of isotropy, and the last 5 present a single axis. Due to these systems, it is acknowledged that the symmetry characteristic of the electrical field is that of a cone's frustum, while the symmetry characteristic of the magnetic field is that of the rotating cylinder. It can then be understood under what conditions a physical individual, whose genesis has been determined by a polarization corresponding to a structure characterized by a certain type of symmetry, can produce a phenomenon that presents a determined polarization. Thus, a phenomenon noted by Novalis and celebrated in the poetic invocation of the tire senders, crystal Tourmaline, can be understood based on the system of the symmetry of the cone's frustum. The symmetry of the tourmaline is that of a triangular pyramid. A crystal of heated tourmaline reveals an electrical polarity in the direction of its ternary axis. The tourmaline is already polarized at ordinary temperatures, but a slow displacement of electrical charges compensates this polarization. The heating only modifies the state of polarization in a manner such that compensation no longer takes place given a certain time, but the crystal structure has not been modified. Similarly, magnetic rotatory polarization is linked to the symmetry characteristic of the magnetic field, that of the rotating cylinder. Ultimately, the interpretation becomes particularly interesting in the case of the phenomenon of piezoelectricity discovered by Jacques and Pierre Curie. It consists in the appearance of electrical charges through the compression of mechanical dilation of certain crystals, compression or mechanical dilation. Since the phenomenon consists in the appearance of an electrical field, the symmetry of the system that produces this field, the crystal and forces of compression, must be at best that of the frustum of the cone. Hence the fact that pyroelectric crystals can be piezoelectric by compressing a crystal of tourmaline along the ternary pyroelectric axis. The appearance of electrical charges of the opposite sign are established. By contrast, crystals like those of quartz, which only have a ternary symmetry, the extremities of the binary axes are not equivalent, are not pyroelectric, but piezoelectric, because when a pressure is exerted along a binary axis, the only element of symmetry common to the crystal and the compression is this binary axis. This symmetry, a subgroup of the symmetry of the frustum of the cone, is compatible with the appearance of an electrical field along this axis. In such a crystal, the electrical polarization can also be determined by a compression perpendicular to the facets of the prism. The only element of symmetry common to the crystal symmetry and to the cylindrical symmetry of compression is the binary axis perpendicular to the direction of the force of compression. The result is that crystals with no center of symmetry can be piezoelectric. This is the case of Rochelle salt, potassium sodium tartrate, which is orthorhombic and has an enantiomorphic hemihydry, and whose chemical composition is indicated by the formula CO2K, CHOH, CHOH, CO2Na.
Okay, yeah, you can stop there. Thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion of crystals here, which I think is not super important to grasp all the details of. Although Angus has posted some useful information in the chat here. So the frustum of a cone is the portion of a cone or a pyramid which remains after its upper part has been cut off by a plane parallel to its base, or which is intercepted between two such planes. So there's a picture in the chat there which helps to visualize this. But the discussion of the different groups of symmetries on page 82. So he gives the 7 groups. So the 32 different symmetries all fall under one of these 7 groups, and it also sometimes classed as 6 groups depending on the basis of that classification. But different crystalline structures have different forms of symmetry in terms of how they can be rotated or reflected, the different types, the different ways in which that structure is preserved under rotation or reflection or other forms of symmetry. And these 7 groups are the sort of general groups under which those forms of symmetry exist. And then what he describes in the next couple or the next paragraph or so is the way that different properties of these crystals have to align with the axes of symmetry along these different forms of symmetry. So certain crystals like this tourmaline has this property of electrical polarity when it's heated. So it's a pyroelectric crystal. Pyroelectric meaning that the heating the crystal produces an electrical field. And then what's the next example? Right, and then there's other crystals that have the piezoelectric property, so that compression of the crystal produces an electric field. And as Ben pointed out, this is how quartz watches work. So the compression of the crystal produces an electrical field, which is then used to sorry, it also has a periodic structure to it. So that's sort of what synchronizes the watch, is how I understand it. But I'm far from an expert, so maybe someone else has a better can explain that better. But as I said, I don't think the details are super important here. The basic idea is that the different properties of the crystals have to do with the different symmetrical structures of the crystalline structure. And so there's this polarization that he pointed to a little while ago occurs along these different axes of symmetry of the crystal. Alyosha, I'm not sure I understand exactly your question, but I would just, I guess, point out there that I think there's I think there's a bit of a translation issue with that passage that you quoted. So I think at best should instead be at most. So it should be the symmetry of the system that produces this field, the crystalline forces of compression must at most be that of the frustum of the cone. He's saying that there's only as many symmetries as the frustum of a cone has, and not more symmetries than that.
So it seems the point of this discussion of symmetry here, at least as I can gather, and I'm not, most of this is way over my, but it's, I mean, so it's coming into context of this material condition that he's mentioned. And I wonder if this may be an illustration of that, like the symmetry is really that sort of material condition that plays this mediating role between a germ and a field of potential.
I think, well, my understanding at least is that when he's talking about the symmetry and dissymmetry here, this has to do with the structural condition, so the germ rather than the material condition. The germ introduces a dissymmetry into the system, a polarization into the system, and then the polarization occurs along these particular axes depending on the properties of the chemical substance in particular that is undergoing the process of crystallization. So the polarization along different axes is what is introduced by the structural germ, and so I think that's sort of how this bit fits in with the bigger picture.
I guess I'm thinking of this sentence. I think it was just at the end of the last reading, where he speaks of a characteristic symmetry. So he says, above all, the particular interest of Curie's laws resides in their precise statement: a phenomenon can exist in a milieu that possesses its characteristic symmetry, or that of one of the subgroups of this symmetry. And I guess this characteristic symmetry makes me, it seems like it's a, and then he gives a kind of group, the different groupings. He elaborates. So yeah, this characteristic symmetry, I guess, was making me think of the material condition, like it's some kind of, it's not just an abstract potentiality, but it has a certain degree of potential structure or structured potential. I don't know what to call it exactly. Yet without being, as far as the degree of, without going as far as individuation. So we can speak of a characteristic symmetry even without, even in a kind of an amorphous or metastable solution prior to the germ being introduced. Though I don't know, that's just kind of speculating on my part.
Well, prior to the introduction of the germ, the amorphous solution has, I guess, a infinite symmetry, or I mean, you could put it either as it has an infinite number of symmetries or no symmetries, because any rotation or reflection of the amorphous mass will result in something that is the same as it was before. So it doesn't have any privileged directions. It's isotropic. So the role of these polarizations, or sorry, to put it another way, the polarizations or the symmetries only exist insofar as there is something like a polarization, so a certain direction that has some sort of differentiation of properties. So it can be electrical, magnetic, refraction of light, or whatever other properties that the substance can have. But those properties have to differ along some axis. So one axis has the property in some way, and then another axis doesn't have that property at all. And so, so because of that, these symmetries have to do with they're related to the structural germ. Of course, the material condition is always a condition for the system as a whole to take on this polarization. So if you don't have the right, it's only that the substance with a certain chemical structure that is able to take on particular forms of symmetry. But it's only in the structured state, so after the process of crystallization, that these symmetries exist, because you have that polarization or that differentiation along different axes. Okay, so we can continue. I think I'll read the next bit. The habit that compels us to think according to common genera, specific differences, and distinctive features is so strong that we cannot avoid using terms that imply an implicit natural classification. With this reservation in mind, if we consent to subtract from the word property the meaning that it takes in a natural classification, we shall say that, according to the preceding analysis, the properties of a crystalline individual express and actualize the polarity or bundle of properties that have presided over its genesis by prolonging this polarity. A crystal, which is a structured matter, can become a structuring being. It is both the consequence and the cause of this polarization of matter, without which it would not exist. Its structure is a received structure, since it has required a germ, but the germ is not substantially distinct from the crystal. It remains included in the crystal, which becomes like a more extensive germ. Here the soma is coextensive with the germen, and the germen is coextensive with the soma. The germen becomes soma. Its function is coextensive with the limit of the crystal that develops. This power of structuring an amorphous milieu is in some sense a property of the crystal's limit. It requires this symmetry between the interior state of the crystal and the state of its milieu. The genetic properties of a crystal are prominently manifested on its surface. They are the limit's properties. Thus, if we want to be rigorous, we cannot say the properties of the crystal. They are instead modalities of the relation between the crystal and the amorphous body. It is because the crystal is perpetually unfinished in a maintained state of suspended genesis that it possesses what can be uniquely called properties. These properties are in fact the ongoing disequilibrium manifested by the relations with the polarized fields and by the creation, at the limit of the crystal and around it, of a field that has a polarity determined by the crystal structure. By generalizing Curie's laws, we would find that a purely amorphous substance would not create polarized fields if it weren't rendered anisotropic by particular polarizing conditions, like a compression according to a determined direction or a magnetic field. A singularity is polarized. The veritable properties of the individual are at the level of its genesis, and for this very reason, at the level of its relation with other beings, since if the individual is the being that is always capable of continuing its genesis, this genetic dynamism resides in its relation to other beings. The ontogenetic operation of the crystal's individuation is accomplished on its surface. The interior layers represent a past activity, but the superficial layers are the deposits of this power of growing, insofar as they are in relation with a structurable substance. The individual's limit is what it is in the present. It is the limit that manifests the individual's dynamism and that makes this relation exist between the structure and the hylomorphic situation. So here we have again this criticism of the classification into species and genera, which we saw, I think, last week or the week before. And then we also had this on the mode of existence of technical objects. He makes another related criticism of classification in this sense. But here he wants to use the word property, not in relation to some sort of classification scheme, but as we saw in last week's reading, the properties of an entity have to do, so both the continuous and the discontinuous properties are characteristic of an individual entity and have this historical or evental character, so that the discontinuous properties, the ones that have this characteristic of not being continuous, can be used for classification, but they aren't in some way ontologically separate from the individuals that fall under that category. So their properties have to be understood as including both the discontinuous and the continuous properties of the substance in question. And so he points out here that these properties of the crystal have to do with its polarization. So the different axes within the crystal present different properties to observation. And then one other bit that we should probably explain is when he talks about soma and germen. So this is a reference to Weissmann, who was a biologist in the late 19th century, and he set out this conceptual distinction between the soma, the body of an organism, and the germen, which is the reproductive cells of the organism. And so he points out that it's only the reproductive cells of the organism that are passed on to the offspring, and then that go into the formation of the offspring. So the germen is in a sense immortal. It lives on from one generation to the next, whereas the soma it's reformed and dies out in each generation. But here Simondon points out that in the case of the crystal, there's no distinction between the soma and the germen, because the seed or the germ of the crystal just becomes part of the crystal as the crystal forms. There's no distinction in terms of what they're made of or what they're composed of between the germ and the crystal that forms. Yeah, there's a nice diagram that Triad posted in the chat there. So each the germplasm or the germen lives on from one generation to the next, and then at each generation it produces a soma, and then the soma dies out in each generation. So there's a continuity of the germplasm across generations, whereas there's a discontinuity at the level of the soma. Right. Yes, I probably should have mentioned that. Yeah, soma is the Greek term for body. So it really just means the body of the organism, insofar as it's distinguished from the reproductive cells. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next bit if someone else would like to pick up from the top of 85.
Okay. A being totally symmetrical in itself and symmetrical with respect to the beings that would limit it would be neutral and without properties. Properties are not substantial but relational. They only exist through the interruption of a becoming. Temporality, insofar as it expresses or constitutes the most perfect model of asymmetry, the present is not symmetrical with the past because the flow of time is irreversible, is necessary to the individual's existence. Perhaps there is also a perfect reversibility between temporality and individuation, since time is always the time of a relation, which can only exist at the limit of an individual. According to this doctrine, it could be said that time is relation, and that there is no veritable relation that is not asymmetrical. Physical time exists as a relation between an amorphous term and a structured term, the first being the carrier of potential energy and the second that of an asymmetrical structure. What also results from seeing things this way is that every structure is simultaneously structuring and structured. Each structure can be grasped in its twofold aspect when it is manifested in the present of the relation between an amorphous potentialized state and a substance structured in the past. From that point, the relation between the future and the past would be the very thing that we witness between the amorphous milieu and the crystal. The present, the relation between the past and the future, is like the polarizing asymmetrical limit between the crystal and the amorphous milieu. This limit can neither be grasped as a potential nor as a structure. It is not interior to the crystal, but it no longer belongs to the amorphous milieu. However, in another sense, it is an integral part of both terms, since it is provided with all of their properties. The two preceding aspects, including the belonging and non-belonging of the limit to the limited terms, which are opposed like the thesis and the antithesis of a dialectical triad, would remain artificially distinguished and opposed without the characteristic of their constitutive principle. This dissymmetrical relation is indeed the principle of the genesis of the crystal, and the dissymmetry continues throughout the genesis, whence results the nature of the indefiniteness of the crystal's growth. Becoming is not opposed to being, it is the constitutive relation of being qua individual. Consequently, we can say that the physico-chemical individual constituted by a crystal is in becoming qua individual. And it is indeed on this intermediate level between the ensemble and the molecule that the veritable physical individual exists. It can certainly be said in a derivative sense that a certain amount of sulfur is individualized by the fact that it is presented in a determined allotropic form. But this determined state of the overall ensemble does nothing but express on the macroscopic level the underlying and most fundamental reality of existence in the mass of real individuals that have a community of origin. The individualized characteristic of the ensemble is merely the statistical expression of the existence of a certain number of real individuals. If an ensemble envelops many physical individuals from various origins and different structures, it is a mixture and remains poorly individualized. The veritable support of physical individuality is effectively the operation of elementary individuation, even if it only appears indirectly at the level of observation.
Right, so here we have more discussion of time, which he introduced in the introduction of the book, just sort of in passing, where he described how we need to have a genesis of time rather than time being something like the framework in which genesis occurs. Time is itself something that has a genesis and that results from individuation. And we have here some more specification of what that means, so that it has to do with the dissymmetry of time, in the sense that the future and the past are not reversible. You can't. Most physical processes, or many physical processes, proceed only along one direction, and they can't proceed in the opposite direction. So something like burning a piece of paper, for example, the same process can't be run in reverse. So it's asymmetrical in that sense. So the asymmetry here is so in the same sense, the past turning into the future in the present. The present plays the same role as the limit of the crystal, and so it has that same structuring role. And so the past plays the role of the amorphous substance, and the future is the crystallized, structured result of that process. Oh, sorry, I think I said that backwards. It's the future that plays the role of the amorphous substance, and then which contains the potential energy, and then it's the past that is the crystallized result of the process, and then the present is the limit of the crystal.
But the stable state, as far as I understand, there is like a contemporarily, coexisting of the process. Of the phases. So what I want to say is like is it really linearity of time, like a cause and effect thingy, or could we think another possibility, like of course, like of course it is like he explains. Simon explains, time is not irreversible here, but can we think another possibility, like thinking of a metastable as a coexistence of phases, like for example, like individuated coexist at the metastable phase. So should it be only like a kind of a cause and effect, and then time is linear in this process? Yeah, this is my question. I'm afraid like my question.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. So the question is whether the discussion of time here has to do with something like a linear time related to cause and effect, rather than something like the coexistence of phases, like he described in the introduction. And it's an interesting question. I think the way he would want to put it is that the linear time is a result of that dephasing process that he described in the introduction. In the way that the future plays the role of the amorphous mass containing potential energy. So in that amorphous mass, or in that future state, the phases are not differentiated yet. And then it's out of that amorphous mass that the different I guess elements of time, or the different aspects of time, the past, present, and future, will be differentiated. So it's not strictly a linear account of time, but it's an account of the genesis of time out of that amorphous mass.
Yeah, you got the point actually, like a point of my. Thank you. And then maybe like it's kind of like the sorry confusion of corporeality and incorporeality. So I just thought of Bergson, like in terms of Bergson's idea, like as far as I understand, like a time can be mixed, like a past, present, and future. Maybe Simono is trying to explain so in terms of corporality, materiality. So I don't know. Maybe we can figure out this one like by going further, but still like yeah, it makes sense. Like I mean, linearity makes sense, but at the same time, I'm just wondering like something is like intermingled at the particular phase.
Yeah, the reference to Bergson, I think, is something that's sort of in the background in this bit, or whenever he talks about becoming, I think Bergson is always sort of in the background. But I'm not too sure of the specifics here of how this relates to Bergson. Maybe Alyosha has more to say about this, but I think the idea here is maybe not exactly like the Bergsonian idea of the duration and the inner experience of time, because this is still some sort of becoming that is occurring in physical systems rather than within something like a mind. But yeah, I'm not too sure. Maybe Alyosha has more to say on this. Yeah, then that's true about Bergson. That like in creative evolution, he's describing something that's not a psychological process. But yeah, so here we have again coming back to this idea: becoming is not opposed to being. Becoming is a dimension of being in some sense, so that becoming is part of the dephasing of being, or it's constitutive of what the being of an entity is that becoming process, so that there's no opposition between them. Sorry, I'm not stating that very clearly, but that's one of the central ideas of this work, as we saw in the introduction, and so now we see a more concrete development of what that means in this chapter.
So the what is the identity of crystal? What is the identity of crystal? What is a crystal? That's kind of what I understand. That's the seed which produces something. That's what I understand about crystal, and then I have a question about the identity of potential, pre-individuality, potentiality, pre-individuality, crystal. What relations among them? So if I think a crystal equivalent to potentiality or pre-individuality, then I can think of incorporeality, not just a corporeality. That's why I Bergson, cause something kind of incorporeal could be intermingled at some phases, like a metastable state or something like that. But as I told you, like if you go further, we can sort out this question. But thank you so much for your, explanations. Quite helpful.
Yeah, that's an interesting question of whether there's anything, something like an incorporeal going on here, or present in what we're looking at here. I think my my tendency would be to say that there is there's nothing incorporeal yet that we've seen so far, because we are dealing with physical individuation. So the processes that we're seeing here are things that can be measured and studied by the physical sciences, as he pointed out in that sort of note that we saw at the end of the last week's reading. Individuation is something that you can, physical individuation at least, is something that can be studied by the physical sciences, and it's only so philosophical thought has to sort of resituate it as a form of genesis, but it doesn't. The sort of content of that individuation is something that the physical sciences themselves study. But I think when we get to other forms of individuation, it might make more sense to describe to talk about something incorporeal. So especially when we get to psychic individuation. And then the trans-individual, collective individuation, that in those types of individuation, it will make more sense to talk about something incorporeal. But I think here, it doesn't make sense to do that yet.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
I was just looking ahead. We have like 2 medium-sized paragraphs to get through, and we only have like 2 minutes. Sorry, I was going to say that we could try to push through the last little bit to finish this section for today, but I think maybe we probably don't have time because people probably have to leave right at 4. So maybe this would be a good place to stop here for today. We'll finish. We have there's a couple of paragraphs which were not included in the 1964 edition of this book. But that were part of the thesis that he wrote and that are published in the 2005 edition of the book. And so we have some more discussion of Plato and the relationship between physics and philosophy. So we'll keep that for next week, and then we'll start on subsection 3. So thank you everyone for your participation and for attending and so on. And see you all next week.